Today we're going to have an exciting video. I'm going to be showing you a case study for Circl, which is a company that I worked for previously, and I'll discuss what growth marketing strategy that I envisioned and deployed for the company. I'll give you a lot more context as I go through the video. And yes, before we officially begin, when we talk about strategy, very much related to the word creativity, that it can be subjective. But for me, strategy is simply a vision or a roadmap towards a specific goal, right? Whereas a plan is a more specific and short-term approach to helping you achieve the overall strategy. Think of a plan as a short-term view of how to achieve specific sub-goals, whereas a strategy is a long-term approach to achieving bigger goals. So why should you listen to my case study? If you look at some top-line KPIs here, we can see from the 8 months that I joined the company prior to the previous 8 months, this is what I've achieved. You can see a plus 5.87% increase in app installs, which is, to be fair, a vanity metric. Same with registered accounts, that's plus 349%. But if we look at very important KPIs, like an active user, what that really means is an active paying user, that's up 323%. And then finally, an engaged user is up 70.25% comparing to the previous 8 months prior to me joining. And when I talk about engaged user, that's a user that's already done the main conversion you want. So there's another post conversion that's happening. And this is when they've essentially played the game again, or they've added another deposit. And that will make a lot of sense as I go through the slides. So if you're wondering where the data is coming from, so this is directly from AppsFlyer, which is our mobile measurement partner. So you can see from August 2022 to March 2023, at least on iOS and Android, you can see some top line metrics here. So all the columns here are basically conversions. On this aspect here are the specific channels or marketing channels. If you focus on the purchase metric, you can see the attribution dates there just for visibility. Moving on to the next 8 months, so April 1 to December 31 of last year, that's essentially 5x in terms of that specific event. So I've got data to support me. Let me give you a bit of introduction into who I am. I'm Jonathan Milanis. I consider myself a futurist digital marketing expert. I've consulted for early stage startups all the way to more established businesses, some of which you may have heard of: BMW, Audible, Meta. So I have quite a wide vertical experience from that point of view. I'm also a founder of a few businesses, one of them being this YouTube channel that you're watching. So I'm the lead instructor here at Futurist Marketers. Futurist Marketers, it's a platform dedicated in upskilling and future-proofing the next generation of digital marketers. So that's a bit about me. Let's carry on with the case study here. So the account or brand that I worked for is Circl. So for context, Circl is a B2C football gaming app under the gambling niche. So you can imagine it's very highly regulated. There's a lot of compliance procedures that are happening. Some further details here. We are live across 3 different platforms: website, iOS, and Android. So the reason why I see iOS and Android as 2 separate entities or 2 different platforms is iOS is built on an entirely different framework as opposed to Android. So that's the first reason. Second reason is that your mobile measurement partner or your analytics tool or even your CRM are going to see the data that come from both different devices as 2 separate data points, right? They're not seen as one device. Although there's a way for you to merge those data points. Just for simplicity's sake, let's keep them separate. And even in your paid channels, right, they're going to be seen as 2 different platforms. Let's say on Facebook, you can't have a campaign that's optimized or showing to both devices at the same time if we're talking about an app install campaign. If you're wondering why I'm using the term platforms, it's because AppsFlyer uses that term. You can use the term device as well, so 3 different devices, but just to be consistent, we'll use the term platform. Again, further context, they're a pre-seed startup, VC backed. There's a lean team of 5, and when I joined in, there was really no growth marketing function. No one was really taking ownership of that. That can be a good or bad thing depending on what type of growth marketer you are, but from my point of view, that's great because there's a blank canvas that I can paint on, essentially. And you can see on the screen, there's a few screenshots of what the game looks like. And let's move on to the next slide. So what was my role exactly, and what were some of the top line responsibilities? My role there was a user acquisition growth manager, essentially a growth marketer, right? The term user acquisition is mostly used in the realm of app marketing. So it's a very niche term that likely you won't hear much of, at least in the UK and maybe in the US, but elsewhere in Europe, where there's a lot of app marketing agencies, they use the term user acquisition for essentially growth marketers. So main responsibility is strategic omnichannel growth, being able to develop a comprehensive user acquisition plan at an omnichannel level across all the different platforms. So when I say omnichannel, all that really means is being able to see all the different marketing channels being used, and more so how they correspond, how they are different in terms of cost efficiency and volume, and how they influence each other. Next up is being able to work collaboratively with cross-functional teams, acting as a leader and a marketing advisor. My role there is working directly with the CTO of the company, founders, non-execs, compliance, marketing team, customer support, and the product or the developer team as well. So as you work within marketing or growth, you'll very likely work with different teams, and being able to speak their language is very important. Being able to understand how you both impact each other's roles is very important, and that's something you'll really only get to experience in depth when you work client side versus agency side. You're usually siloed within whatever your role is, right? You don't get as much visibility into other aspects of the business. And then finally, performance and analytics. So this is very standard when you work within marketing. Part of it entails market research, being able to understand who our competitors are, how do people view this product, being able to understand what keywords we should target, what's a cost-efficient cost per acquisition for the various channels that we're going to use, being able to understand the qualitative and quantitative analysis of some of our marketing efforts. What is our best performing headline or our best performing creative? What do people resonate with in terms of ad copy, for example? And part of it entails being able to deploy growth experiments, which I'll touch on in a couple of slides, which is essentially ways of validating an idea to improve specific KPIs, whether that's at a channel specific level or a creative or a campaign and elsewhere, right? Maybe being able to understand if conversion rates are better from your website versus iOS versus Android. All right, so some further context and some of the challenges that I came across as I was onboarding. First one is, even though the company has been around for 3 years, they were essentially still trying to figure out product market fit. If you found it as a company, all that really means that your company is more so profitable. You've found an audience that is demanding your product. There's a specific market that you've tapped into with the right messaging, with the right time, right? So that's what product market fit is. When I joined in, I would say up until even by the time that I left the company, they were still trying to figure that out, right? There wasn't product market fit. And again, when I joined in, there was a new game being released. So in a way, it was almost as if we were trying to validate if the product can work with growth, right? And that's a whole other video, whether or not you should do that. Second thing is growth was failing. So even though they've been a company for 3 years, there wasn't really growth happening. And even though they worked with an agency managing their paid advertising channels, because of the disconnect between both parties, there wasn't an upwards trajectory. There's a lot of friction happening, hence having me on board to really take ownership of growth and user acquisition and being able to create systems and processes for that to be possible. Third thing is, even though they had a lot of different tools, softwares, there was really a lack of tech utilization. And you'll find that a lot with, at least in the world of marketing, we're going to be introduced to 10 different tools. No one quite knows how to fully utilize those tools in depth. And no one usually takes ownership of specific tools. Might be different in your case, but from my experience, that happens more so than not. Part of my role is being able to utilize some of those softwares a lot more in depth. Mobile measurement partner, Facebook ads, affiliate marketing, app store optimization, those channels. Number 4, my direct report was the founder and CTO of the company, which is great for me because there wasn't really a hierarchy. And maybe that's because it's a startup, but being able to explain and validate what I'm doing directly with the founder, and the person pretty much built the app itself is great. If I had issues with conversion tracking, I could just liaise that with him and it will get fixed within the hour. And if I needed context from a business point of view, or I could relay some information to him, let's say I'm seeing a specific competitor change their creatives or have a different way of them onboarding their users, I can liaise that directly to him and the product team, essentially. Next, number 5 is, as mentioned earlier, when I joined in, it was pretty much a blank slate in terms of the growth aspect. So I had a blank canvas to paint in the way that I wanted to. And that relates to the next one, number 6, is being able to have full autonomy of a 6-figure budget across the year. And that comes with a lot of pressure as well, right? When you don't have an idea of how they've allocated spends before, which channels are going to be effective because they didn't trial really much marketing channels prior to me joining. And the great thing is, me and the CTO of the company knew that we were going into it with an experimenting mindset and spend a bit of money to gather those insights and using those insights to validate this strategy, right? You don't want to create a strategy where there is no data, right? If there is no data, that means you have to pay for that data to then extract those insights from the data, which then creates a better strategy because now you have something tangible to latch onto. All right, so just some timelines here. I've simplified it obviously because trying to do a week-on-week overview of what I did is probably a bit overkill, but I joined at the latter half of March, but let's just assume that I started officially April. Between April and May, a lot of the focus was onboarding, getting to understand the business, getting to understand the team. Part of it was auditing what they've done previously, what their website user journey is versus the app, being able to dictate a strategy into what we should be doing to understand the best marketing channels and how much we should allocate, what types of creatives we're going to use. And that entails being able to forecast how we're going to spend in terms of finances, media planning, which is essentially deciding what channels we're going to use, what's the brief behind it, what's the goal, what's the budget allocation at a channel level, what keywords or audiences we're going to be targeting. Part of that entailed activating a few channels: Facebook ads, Google, App Store optimization, Reddit, Twitter, PR as well. There's a lot involved in there. And part of my onboarding obviously entailed being able to understand who's my resource, right? Who's at my disposal to essentially utilize. Do we have in-house designers? Do we have a brand team that helps with creatives or maybe the positioning of the ad copy? Do we have developers to help with conversion tracking? Or if I have any issues with integrating API from one platform to another, do I have that? The more senior you become, that's one of the first things you want to understand. Who's at my disposal? Who can I use? For context, obviously, it's a football gaming app, and most of the game was dictated by the Premier League matches. I'm not a football fan myself, but during June and July, it's essentially the season is off, right? Premier League isn't happening. So there wasn't a lot of games happening within the app itself. And so there wasn't really much reason to have a lot of pay channels switched on. Would either switch off some of the channels or reduce the daily budget, right? So there's a seasonality aspect that you have to react to when you think about growth. And again, omnichannel evaluation, we were still testing different channels out. In performance marketing, you need enough data there to understand whether or not the channel works. Let's get a bit more visibility in what I mean by that. Let's say with Google Ads, you set up a Performance Max campaign, you would need at least 30 conversions to validate whether it's a winning channel or not, irrelevant of the spend. And you're going to have limitations across that because the question is, those 30 conversions, is that statistically significant? And that's a whole other video in itself. But my advice would be, get closer to the truth. If you know that there's volume there and it's a cost-efficient channel, validate that further. Maybe double the spends and see if that fact is still relevant. So be able to challenge the insights you gather rather than trying to find the perfect insight from that specific channel, because it's very likely not going to happen. If you can get 70% closer to the truth of what you're trying to figure out, that's more than good enough. I'll take it. So as it was pretty much off season, I could focus on other channels, more so on organic. So in the world of app marketing, I was able to focus much more on App Store optimization. I wouldn't necessarily say that ASO or App Store optimization is the SEO version of app marketing. App Store optimization does have similarities with SEO, but it's there's a lot more nuances. I was able to focus much more on how can we position our app so we organically rank a lot higher. Can we A/B test different descriptions? Can we focus on specific opportune keywords or keywords that we know that isn't difficult to rank for and that there's less competition that is still relevant for our business, right? Can we improve our creatives and being able to understand what our competitors are doing, what type of positioning do they use in their copy, what type of creatives do they use, are they using a specific incentive to funnel in new users, so on and so forth, right? That's more in the App Store optimization aspect. During June, July, we were also relaunching the website. Although we had a website previously, we wanted users to have a different experience and essentially play the game through the website. The developers were working on that behind the scenes. Next up is during August to September, this was the time where we really wanted to push channels back. This is the time where we wanted to push spends back onto some of those platforms. More specifically, our best performing channels were really Facebook ads and affiliate marketing. In terms of cost efficiency and volume, we know that we didn't necessarily oversaturate those audiences yet, so we could push spend. We also wanted to really experiment if we can get more volume through our website. As mentioned, we relaunched that website back in early August. We had two separate campaigns, at least on Facebook, where one was specifically driving to the app or the App Store, and the other campaign was driving towards the website. And we would basically understand, is the conversion rate for a paying user a lot better on the website versus the app? And the answer to that is initially it was the website, but as weeks went on, we realized that the app was a better channel for us. And then October, November, again, it's really just scaling those growth channels. As mentioned, that's Facebook and affiliate marketing. So we were starting to push spends upwards of £30,000 a month. And the good thing about having fewer channels that I could personally focus on really a cadence in growth experiments, I had a lot more of a rapid deployment of those experiments. The more channels you have, it's almost as if it's harder to do growth experiments, right? Because you have more options. If you're doing an experiment from one channel, that's going to affect another channel. So it's a lot more difficult in that sense. Whereas you focus on the channels that do really well for your business, you can really zoom in and find a bit of a rhythm and experiments. So some of those experiments are on the App Store itself. It's being able to A/B test different app icons, A/B testing different app descriptions, and even the subtitle or the short description of the app, kind of A/B testing, which is a better performing one across iOS and Android. On the Facebook side, being able to simply A/B test creative testing or maybe a different objective. Should we try Advantage Plus or should we do the manual campaign optimized towards the CAPI conversion that we want, and seeing which is more cost efficient and which has better conversion rates. And then by December, this is the time where we started to really shift from user acquisition towards user retention. And when we talk about user retention, it's, from my point of view, it's not necessarily lifetime value, right? Although it can be. User retention for us was being able to understand how can we get the users playing the game for as long as possible, not just one-off. So after 2 weeks, we still want them to play the game, irrelevant of how much they spend, as long as they're spending with us. So some of the channels we started to focus on was email marketing, which is pretty much one of the main channels you're going to double down on in terms of user retention. So we started to A/B test different nurturing campaigns, updated some of the copy. We started to focus on the product. So how can we improve the website user journey so we can essentially improve the conversion rates of them paying? So how that's deployed is, should they have the ability to add their credit card before they buy tickets, or vice versa? Should they choose the tickets that they want or how many tickets they want and then add their credit card details? So there was a conversion optimization approach by December. And then we started to use SMS marketing through Twilio, because we know that in Germany, that's a big thing. So our VC firm recommended to essentially trial SMS marketing. And really audit our push notification strategy. So taking a look at what type of push notifications gets the most clicks, the most engagement, and can we further improve those and start to categorize some of those themes and find a pattern of which are the best performing ones and double down on those. So if we find that if there's a specific push notification focused on fear of missing out, like there's a deadline into play the game, we would essentially deploy more of those type of notifications. Next, we're going to talk about growth audits. What that simply means is when you're trying to grow specific metrics or KPIs, key performance indicators, there's a simple framework that I use, and I'll explain it now. So the first thing is being able to understand historical data. What has been done previously? What does the data tell us? Which are the best performing channels? What's our average baseline KPIs, which is a very important thing, right? You want to understand how much are we currently paying for customers? How much are we paying for upper funnel metrics? How much are we paying for our primary KPI? And what have we done previously in terms of implementations, right? Because that's going to help you dictate what to do moving forward. There's that saying, you can't move forward in life if you don't look back. So that's my approach in terms of growth. As mentioned earlier, you want to be able to understand what resources do you have at your disposal, right? Do you have a dedicated creative team of designers? Can you utilize AI to do your work? Do you have the ability to collaborate with developers just in case there's a tech stack implementation or attribution issue you're facing? And what type of levers do you have within the company and outside the company? Being able to understand essentially the tools you have. So think if you're building a house, you want to be able to understand what the things you can do and the things you can't do. And if there's things you can't do, hopefully you have tools and people to help you to achieve some of those things. And a part of growth, or really part of leadership in this case, it's thinking ahead, thinking in terms of innovation. What can we improve in terms of processes? What can we simplify so all of our jobs are a lot easier? Right, so as mentioned, strategy is simply a roadmap to achieve your overall end goal as a business. To be able to dictate a strategy, what is the end goal? What's the primary KPI we're trying to improve? That's very important, right? So for us, it was really being able to acquire paying users or active paying users at a cost per acquisition of £35. And if you're wondering why is that the number, the founders, that's the promise that they made to their investors. So I wasn't necessarily involved. And the second thing here is, do we have a unified source of truth? So when you talk about strategy, you want to understand the data that comes in, but it's very likely in the realm of marketing, you're going to have 2 to 3, maybe more different sources of truth. And you want a unified version of that. What's the most truest source of truth we can get? Because that's going to be where we all cross-reference if we're actually improving or hitting that target. It's very likely going to be an internal database or CRM that your company is using. So now you want to be able to relay that with some of your marketing channels, right? So find a way to unify that source of truth. Right, next up is, now we know our primary KPI, we know where we're going to find our source of truth. What's the roadmap to achieving that, right? Roadmap that you could dictate that in terms of timelines. First month, this is what we're going to do. Second month, this is what we're going to do. Here's the reason why. So as mentioned earlier, I'll give you a bit of a timeline of how this is going to happen, but just for context, target was a £35 CPA per active user. The other goal was to evaluate which marketing channels are more cost effective and where we could essentially acquire volume of users. And another question we had in mind or goal was to understand whether we should be more aggressive in terms of product development and advertising spend towards the website or the app. Next up is financial and media planning. Whenever we talk about growth marketing, it's very likely these are some of the elements you're going to have to think of, especially in the financial aspect. The more senior you become in marketing, you become more of a financial advisor on how to properly deploy that spend. Some of the frameworks that I can share with you is, if you look at the left-hand side here, be able to know your numbers, right? You got to know your numbers inside out. So what's our targets? What have we done previously? How much do we have, right? How much do we have to spend? Is there an efficiency point of view? Another very important metric that I find that a lot of marketers might not really expand on is, what's our value per conversion or value per user, right? And you can only really get that number once you acquired a user and they've spent money with you. Next is channel selection and budget allocation. So this is more so in the media planning aspect. You want to be able to understand which channels are we going to try out for whatever the campaign is, whatever the goal is for that specific account or brand that you're working with, how you're going to allocate that spend across the different channels. I'll be very transparent. There is no perfect science to it. It's a balance of understanding where can we get more volume of conversions, where can we get more cost efficiency. I'll keep it very simple. Let's say you get a lot more users from paid search, right? And you might have your stakeholders ask, if we can get volume and cost efficiency from Google, why are we spending money, or on paid search, why are we spending money on Facebook? The simplified answer I would do to justify having an omnichannel marketing approach is not everyone in Google is going to be using Facebook and vice versa. Not everyone who uses Facebook will use YouTube, right? And so the reason why you want to be omnichannel with your approach to growth and marketing is you're going to tap into audiences that don't necessarily overlap between the different channels or the different platforms. And the only caveat to point out is, as I'm sure you already know, that your cost per lead and volumes or cost per acquisition and volume in terms of conversion is going to be different. So as great as it is to have a primary KPI, know the value of having different channels, being able to show awareness to your audience from different channels, right? So an extreme use case would be when we deployed a PR campaign, we were across 2 different well-respected publications in the football industry. But in terms of attribution from a conversion point of view, there wasn't much. Our CPA was 20, 30x what we were seeing from Facebook ads, for example. And so being able to justify the value PR is you don't think of it from a cost per acquisition point of view. You think about incremental uplift. You think about reputation, which is not something you can capture in a KPI, unfortunately. So you've got to think about those reasonings as a marketer when you're media planning. Next up is other parameters to think about: audience targeting, as mentioned, resources. Who do I have at my disposal to help me with my job? And then actually the activation of these channels, right? So strategy to planning to activation to launching these campaigns across the different channels. Let's zoom in terms of omnichannel evaluation. So once you've deployed these campaigns, the way you evaluate which channel is working and which isn't is asking questions like, where is the volume of conversions coming from, right? Where is the cost efficiency coming from? In terms of cost per acquisition, is channel A doing better for us? And why is that? Is it because it's a intent-driven channel where conversion rates tend to be a lot better? Or is it because most of our users hang about with that channel? And when we talk about cost efficiency, as mentioned previously, you can't necessarily always compare and contrast cost per acquisition from one channel to another. It's likely that they're never going to quite be in similar ranges. And so that's something you have to keep in mind. It's not always about going with the channel that's most cost efficient, right? You want to think about the net value of that conversion at a channel level. And this is something I've experienced with Circl, where it was very cost efficient to do affiliate marketing, but the inherent value and user retention of those users were really a lot lower compared to Facebook ads, where our CPA was 3-4x. Again, there's some of these questions you have to almost ask in tandem with each other, right? Where's the volume coming from? Where's the cost efficiency coming from? And then another question you can ask is, which channels can I scale further? And what I mean by that is, can I add more spend to it? And are we going to hit a certain saturation point? When we talk about saturation point, this is essentially an approach where if we know that channel is doing well for us, obviously since we live in the world of capitalism and we're talking about growth, if we add more money to it, if we add more fuel to the fire, where is the exhaustion point of that fire? So if we add £20,000 more, are we going to see an incremental uplift in conversions? And is the cost per acquisition going to be the same, right? And it's not always going to be the case. Just because you add more money, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get more conversions, right? There's going to be a saturation point where these platforms you give them the money, they're going to spend it. That's how most of these platforms work, right? Their business model is from advertisers spending. And as a growth marketer, you want to understand, what's that saturation point? Is there a point in us going aggressive? So there's a seasonality point of view that you need to think about as well. So we can't talk about growth if we don't talk about reporting and growth experiments. So some of the frameworks you can think about is have a reporting system. And that could be a business intelligence tool. In my case, I was using a simple Google Sheet, which I'll show you in a couple of slides, and be able to understand where am I taking the data from, right? So maybe top line KPIs like spend, traffic, I can take that from the platforms, whereas conversions I'm going to take from my internal database, and I'm going to cross-reference the two. Second thing is, my primary focus is the primary KPI, right? It's easy to get lost in the vast amount of KPIs we can use at our disposal as marketers. But what's the primary KPI? That's all that matters, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be thinking about your secondary KPIs as guidelines. Third thing is, be able to quality assure the data that you see with your teams. So internal data. Let's say with Facebook, you might see that Facebook might be over attributing, right? It might be duplicating conversions for whatever reason. It might say you have 100 app installs, whereas realistically, when you look at your internal data or your CRM, you might say you only have 80. So I would rely in your internal data from that point of view. And for most of the time, it's much better to trust the internal data that you have, much more so than these platforms, in my opinion. Number 4 is, when you talk about growth, is you have a lot of roles and responsibilities. And so being able to systemize and really organize your experiments and your growth roadmap is very important. And I can show you what that looks like later on. And then finally, number 5, have average baseline KPIs at a weekly, monthly, and yearly point of view. So an average baseline KPI is just an understanding of what's our average click-through rate, omnichannel, what's our average cost per acquisition from Facebook compared to Google Ads, compared to overall CPA, including organic channels. Because then you can start to use that as a guideline to see if your performance is improving or if it's what you're actioning is of detriment towards that average baseline KPI. Right? It's a way to assess. So let's move on to reporting. So this is a very simplified version of how I did reporting for Circl. You can see here is the month itself. Second column is these various channels we used and specific objectives within those channels. Budget allocation, and then some very upper funnel metrics here. Impressions, clicks, or taps. But I usually focus much more on the post-click conversion, right? So you can see app installs, registrations, and then total deposits, which dictates an active paying user. So whenever you think about growth, it's very important that you understand the post-click journey, or some marketers might call it the full funnel journey of a user, right? So from point of brand awareness all the way to them converting, and then obviously the post-conversion journey, which is more about user retention and lifetime value, which is not the topic of today's video. And you want to be able to understand a breakdown of those specific KPIs per channel, right? Because you might get a lot of volume from one channel, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of that user is as high upon another channel that has maybe a higher CPA. A balancing act between the two, cost efficiency and volume. What I tend to do is any upper funnel metric I will directly take from the channel. Any conversion based KPI I take from our internal data or CRM, or from our mobile measurement partner, AppsFlyer in this instance. Right, so we talked about growth experiments previously, but the way that I like to systemize it is simply using a Google Sheet. So you can see obviously what that looks like here. First column is your hypothesis. This is you understanding what is it that I'm trying to improve? What's my idea? And then the next thing is what channel is it going to be deployed on, or what channel is going to be involved in this. Pilot start and end, that's when the experiment starts and ends. What's the status? Is it in the ideation process? Is it ongoing? Is it planning? Is it finished? And then some notes here. This is more like a diary of your approach to that specific growth experiment. And then you've got the end result, which is really the culmination of what happened after the experiment has been deployed. So the way that I see growth experiments is, if you're the growth marketer of the company, hopefully you're the one managing it, and I would recommend that you really take ownership of this process. Think of a growth experiment sheet like this, almost like a way of you journaling how you're growing specific KPIs for specific channels or for specific use cases. And you could see it as a way to help you look back on what you've done previously and potentially dictate what things you can trial out in the future. Just before we close off, let's touch on MarTech Stack, which stands for Marketing Technology Stack, or essentially the tools you use in marketing, right? So for Circl, there was quite a few. So CRM, we had our bespoke custom built one. Data analytics and reporting, as you've seen, it's either use a Google Sheet. I did build out a Looker Studio data viz, but we never really used it in the end because of attribution issues. But I was taking upper funnel metrics from the platforms themselves, so from Facebook, Google, Reddit, so on and so forth. But any conversion-based event or data I take from either from Google Analytics 4, which is our web analytics software, or our mobile measuring partner, MMP Apps Flyer. And I would always cross-reference those conversions with our internal CRM data, which I would really get our CTO to export and then send to me. Then I can cross-reference with the UTM parameters that the CRM essentially gets and see if that matches with our various channel data, which it never quite was accurate, but I'd rather trust our internal data than what external channels are telling us, at least from a conversion point of view. So content management system, we didn't really use one, but there was a website. It's very likely in your job, you're going to have some sort of a content management system. You can update ad copy or various meta tags, which we don't have time to get into now. And then other tech stacks you're going to use, obviously the various channels, softwares you use, whether that's Facebook, Google, Reddit. In terms of affiliate marketing, you might be using Awin, you might be using Commission Junction, and then project management, which is very important when you talk about growth marketing, just because you're collaborating with so many different teams or you've got a lot of different deliverables. We were using Monday, but you could use Asana, you could use Notion, or you can use Google Sheets or an Excel, whatever is easier for you, as long as you're on track of what's happening, who's taking ownership of specific tasks, when do certain tasks need to be actioned by, and who's really taking ownership of that specific task. And then finally, a hub for your creative assets, any kind of administration documents. When you're setting up a new ad account, for example, you might need the certificate of incorporation of the company. If you work in a highly regulated business like fintech or gambling or health and wellness, you might need specific certificates or forms that you need to provide certain channels or agencies or partners, and you want a organized hub for all those different documents. I'm going to close off the video with lessons and reflections throughout my time there. Hopefully you'll find some value with some of these. So user acquisition is very easy. You can give any person who's half good at Facebook ads some budget, who's semi-decent with designing creatives. And the challenge isn't necessarily the user acquisition, the challenge is the quality of those users. But at least in the realm of B2C and direct-to-consumer, user acquisition is a very easy thing. That's not where I would mostly focus my attention to, or at least as I went through my time there, I realized, okay, acquiring users, it's actually a lot easier, especially when you have an incentive. Next is, and this is a controversial one, but as a business and as a marketer, support finding product market fit first before you even think about growth, right? Because if you think about growth, there is no product market fit. People aren't playing the game, or they're not buying from you the second time around. Or if you're a SaaS, they stop using the product after a month, after the free trial, for example. It becomes more expensive to retain those users, and even if it's cheap to acquire them, if you think of the whole lifetime value of that user, it's probably at the negative. You want to focus on product market fit first before even thinking about growth. Next is the act of balancing being creative and being technically minded. You're going to have to use both roles and characters depending on the situation, but as a marketer, you're really using both skills, and you need to find a happy medium between the two. So when we talk about growth, you really are a balance of being a business partner, being a growth advisor, and being a digital marketing expert. It's a culmination of all those three different things It's not about increasing numbers. It's not just about understanding the latest changes in various platforms. It's not about advising, right? It's really the full approach of these parameters or these responsibilities and being able to provide results at the end of the day and be able to justify those results, irrelevant if it's a positive result or a negative result. You need to have a through line between the business, between growth, and between marketing. And as a growth marketer, you're tying all those different themes into one unified theme. I've said this in my other videos, but you're unifying the theme of growth within the company. And I won't go into too much detail, but working in a startup, it's very risky, especially when there's no product market fit and the company's being backed by investors. Just be mindful of the risk of the startup world. And even with the established businesses, right, there really is no such thing as a secure role. There are a lot of risks with the work environment, or at least in this economy in 2024. So just be mindful of that. As a marketer, start to be more strategic with the steps that you make in life. Right? And I always advise this, and I always say this in my videos, but don't rely on one job. Always have multiple projects you're working on and focus on the variables that you can control, that you can have influence over. Next up is always be testing. Just like a scientist would, right? Even though marketing is mainly a subjective field, we now have the ability to be similar to what scientists are, where we can use the data to dictate whether or not something is working, or if our perspective is validated or justified or not. And especially in the realms of growth, you always want to have a cadence of testing things out to improve a specific KPI or specific channel. As a growth marketer, you're always testing things out and you're always trying to validate an idea. Another thing that I've learned is you become more valuable as a marketer when you become T-shaped. What that means is you have a wide range of skills, but you specialize in one specific channel. In my case, I specialize in growth and performance marketing, but I understand conversion optimization, copywriting, how to build a website, SEO, App Store optimization. The more skills you have, the more value you can provide the company that you work for. And then finally, you'll always have problems. You're going to have all sorts of problems. And the way to alleviate that is be a problem solver, wear that hat, and know that if it does come, there's always a solution to it, right? There can't be a problem if there's no solution. Cause and effect. And if you have a problem-solving mindset, your journey as a marketer will be a lot easier. The same exact thing if you take that same theme onto your personal life. When you have a problem in front of you, always figure out a way to solve that specific problem, right? Don't just give up on the idea that it can't be solved, because it's very likely that it can be solved. All right, that's a very long form video. Hopefully you find some value. And if you have any feedback or any questions, feel free to comment on the video below. If you found some value, I highly encourage you to subscribe. And thanks for watching the video. Till next time, peace.